Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. Have we got a panel for you? I think we have. We have to my left Baroness Olly Grender, Liberal Democrat peer, who's the party's Director of Communications and worked in Number 10 during the coalition, but don't hold that against her. Next to her is Lord Robert Hayward, Conservative peer and an expert on polls. To my right, we have Silkie, Carlo, Director of the Civil Liberties campaign group Big Brother Watch. And to her right, Ben Habib, businessman who's chair of the First Property Group, former Brexit Party MEP who's recently joined its successor party Reform UK. So, we want your questions. 0345 6060 973. You might like to ask, and this is not being dictatorial, but you might like to ask on the plan to house 500 male migrants in a barge off the Dorset coast. You might also like to ask about the suggestion of changing the Equality Act so it protects biological sex and makes excluding trans people from some services legal. 60% of acts of street vandalism lead to cases being dropped by police without a suspect being identified, apparently. And Poland's president has offered this evening to send more fighter jets to Ukraine. Lots of other things you could ask about. I encourage you to pick up the phone and dial 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Anthony in Blackpool. Anthony, what would you like to ask?
Yes, good evening, Iain. The Tory party's processing of asylum seekers, I think, is parlous. Is it?
To be fair, it's the government that processes them, not the Tory party.
Okay, yep. You can be... Okay. Isn't it that the asylum processing... I was going to say something. Isn't it that the,
I know you were.
Sorry.
And you'd have been right.
It is a serious point. Isn't it that the asylum processing system is not fit for purpose? Or rather, is it deliberately not fit for purpose?
Well, that's quite a controversial question. Robert Hayward.
It isn't fit for purpose, which is why you've got this enormous backlog of people claiming asylum. There has to be solutions in one form or another. You touched on the question of the barge in your opening comments. The proposal from the government is to fly people to Rwanda to tackle the backlog that we've got, and you've got gangs ferrying people over here at great expense. And the system is not working, so they've got to find something which will tackle the issue, but I'm not sure that I have a solution for it.
But there has to be a solution. You're in the second chamber of Parliament. Should you not have an opinion on what the solution ought to entail?
Well, as far as I'm concerned,
partly consist of, at least.
It should, as far as I'm concerned, partly consist of a much speedier process in terms of tackling those people who claim asylum as against being economic migrants. And I have migrants within my own family in terms of adopted members of the family. And I therefore understand the issues that one's talking about. But they waited to come to this country through legal routes. I feel sorry for people who've incurred enormous costs to get here, and those are the people that one really needs to tackle, and that is effectively an Anglo-French issue.
Ben Habib.
Well, the question, I think, was on the asylum process itself, so it wasn't really about controlling illegal migration, I think. But the problem, of course, with the asylum process is that human rights isn't applied in a generic way. Human rights law is applied on an individual-by-individual basis, and rightly so. And that means, of course, for the 160,000 people who are waiting for their applications to be processed, every single individual is entitled to make their case, and if they lose, for it to go to the next chamber, then the Supreme Court. If they lose that, it goes to the European Court of Human Rights. And I think there are also special immigration appeals commissions that they can go through. And Begum, what's her name? You know, the girl
Shamima Begum.
Shamima Begum. She went through that route after she failed at the Supreme Court. So the whole human rights process and the asylum application process is itself a very, very complex and protracted one. And I think one of the problems the government's facing is that it has tried to give effect to border control through a deportation process. But of course, deportation is what you do when border control has failed. And they've somehow conflated the two issues.
And the allegation from the caller is that they are deliberately mucking up the immigration system, the asylum system we might go back to Anthony and ask him why he thinks that they would do that.
I can't see any motive, no matter what political persuasion you are, to slow down the asylum process itself. You know, I think it makes sense that once you're in that process, you should be moved along as fast as possible. Whether you end up in Rwanda or a barge or somewhere else, we can debate the rights and wrongs of that outcome. But you do need to move that process on fast once people are in it. I can't see any argument for not doing so.
Olly, Grender.
Well, I think Anthony has hit the nail on the head. 4 years ago, the Home Office practically stopped processing these asylum cases and potentially migrant, potentially asylum. We just don't know.
Why did they do that?
Well, I think it was one of those, and Iain, you've covered this so many times in these programmes, but we've had about 5 kind of moves, e.g. Rwanda, and I'd say that they are impractical, costly, but, dog whistle moves, for want of a better description, to make a point, to try and put people off. Has it worked? Not at all. I mean, 4 years ago, there were 40,000 people in the backlog. You could have spent 20 million. You could have solved it. Now, that's according to the government figures, and I'm slightly sceptical about the 160 a night figure that they're using in some parts of the country. But you could take 2 days of hotel staying for everyone, and you could spend it at least to clear part of the backlog.
Well,
and
you could if you had people to process the claims, but you can't just pick people off the unemployment queue and say you can go and process asylum claims.
No, but what you can't also do, this barge is not going to come into place for months, apparently. So you could at least try and do something along those lines, because otherwise, even to cover the current backlog, you need 300 barges of this size, and that sounds a little bit crazy, and I'm not entirely sure, given the opposition already from Conservative MPs in Dorset, I'm not sure you could litter the coastline with 300 in order to cover this number.
Have you seen the pictures of inside this barge?
I looked at the pictures only because I was listening to you earlier, Iain, and I was slightly terrified by you asking me about seeing the pictures. And yes, I've seen the pictures, and I've seen the snooker table. I think it's been refurbished since it was used by the Dutch, and it was described as inhabitable.
Oppressive, I think
oppressive was the word, yeah. So, but you need 300 more to cover this at the moment, and I'm not sure that is a very good fix. As one of our callers pointed out, when he did his national service in the 1950s, he didn't have any heating. There was 22 people to a barrack, and
But it's fantastic distraction, isn't it? We're all talking about the barge, which only would take 500 people. So the main issue.
We're talking about it because Anthony asked the question.
I know, but it's great from the government's perspective because it just kicks the can down the road for another 24-hour news cycle. And everyone's not looking at the main issue. They're not looking at the backlog. They're not looking at the cost of it.
We're not looking at Nicola Sturgeon, but there is breaking news on Nicola Sturgeon because her husband, Peter Morrell, has been released without charge, pending further investigation. The SNP's former chief executive was arrested this morning in connection with an inquiry into the party's finances. You never know, somebody might like to ask a question on that. I think we can talk about it. It's not sub judice. Silkie, Carlo, let's come to you. Anthony, let me remind you of Anthony's question. Is it the case that the asylum processing system run by the government isn't fit for purpose, or was it never intended to be fit for purpose?
Well, it's certainly not designed in a way that enables people to travel here to make asylum claims lawfully. And I think that's the main problem, and one of the main problems with processing as well, is that there are no safe and legal routes for people to seek asylum in this country. That is a failure by design. I think that it's a failure to uphold our obligations under the Refugee Convention. And, you know, I think that some of the language that's being used around this, I mean, obviously the barge is kind of symbolic of a lot of aspects of government policy on this, but the language is remarkable. I read Robert Jenrick's statement earlier about asylum shoppers and illegals, and this kind of really horrible language that is being used. These people are being totally dehumanised, totally deprioritised. In the last quarter of last year, the majority of people coming over in small boats were Afghans. We spent 22 billion on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is more than we spent on the asylum process over the past 20 years. It says something about our national priorities and about our national character. And I think that something as important as the Refugee Convention, something as important as looking after people, particularly from a part of the world that we have disrupted, to put it lightly. We've ruined people's lives, and there are lots of people who are now seeking safety, women and girls who are at risk in particular, and we're failing in our obligations to them.
Let me go back to Anthony. Anthony, why did you put the question in that way? Do you really believe that the government deliberately have mucked up the asylum system or the immigration system? And if so, why do you think that?
Iain, I wouldn't say mucked up. I'd say it's concerted, it's deliberate. I couldn't agree more with your final commentator. There was a previous commentator who I also applauded. But, you know, this xenophobic rhetoric is just unconscionable. I agree
with you on that. I asked you why you think that it was never intended to be fit for purpose. I'd like you to try and... I mean, you asked the question. You must have an answer to it yourself.
Because there's no signal coming from this government with its rhetoric, which is appalling, that they actually do have any humanitarian... Actually, you know, they used to use the word humanitarian when they were introducing these policies because they were fully well aware that they're completely inhumane. Your commentator who talks about the safe routes, for example, I think the last safe route from Syria was closed down in 2019. The government would rather, shift the focus and put the blame entirely on this swarm of people coming into the country.
OK. Yep. Anthony, thank you very much indeed. Just a bit more on Nicola Sturgeon and her husband, Peter Murrell. Police Scotland, they've issued a statement explicit. Shall I start that again? Put my teeth in. Explicitly stating that the case remains active, so it is sub judice. So if we get any questions on that, we can't take them, apparently. There we go. Right, we'll come to more of your questions in just a moment here on Cross Question. The number to call 0345 6060 973. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
If you've just joined us, we have Silkie, Carlo from Big Brother Watch, Conservative peer Lord Robert Hayward, Liberal Democrat peer Baroness Olly Grender, and Ben Habib, businessman who was a Brexit Party MEP and has recently joined Reform UK. We'll ask him a little bit about that in just a moment, but not before a text question from Sandra in Rochester. Isn't it about time that action is taken to properly protect women's rights to female-only spaces? Now, just a bit of background to this, because the Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, has written to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission to ask if amending the Equality Act is possible so it can protect biological sex, and that would allow for transgender women to be excluded from some women-only settings. Now, Labour has said it welcomes asking the ECHR to carry out this review too. Do the Liberal Democrats, Olly Grender?
Well, there's nothing wrong with a review, of course. The EHRC, as you've rightly said, is saying that they will look into this. They've also warned that this may throw up further ambiguity, and they've actually put that as a warning within their statement. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Equalities Act 2010. I think it works really well, and I think it provides single-sex safe spaces and has provision within it. So I just think that's a good thing. I kind of wonder about the timing and this moment and now. And I do know, and I think it is good that a programme such as this can have a cool, calm conversation about something like this, and you'll know that
so far
you're the first one I've come to. I don't know what the others.
You know me, I'm an optimist. But I wonder why now and in this way. I just query the timing. Again, it's like the barges. It's like this moment. Why this moment? Why not provide guidance, which is desperately needed? I'm a chair of governors of a primary, inner city primary, and schools have been waiting for ages for guidance, and that hasn't been done. Instead, what we have is a press release and a moment, and I have a little bit of a suspicion about this moment, which, let's face it, after all, is really talking about less than 1% of the population, and I just do worry about that a bit.
But it is an ongoing debate, though. I mean, OK, I take your point about timing, but it's not as if this debate isn't being had virtually every day, every week on some news channel or other, or
on some news channel or other.
Ordinary people's conversations.
But I've knocked on doors for, since January, I've knocked on hundreds of doors. I know you believe that, Iain, because you know me so well. I
might believe you. I might not believe many other people. So.
And I've not found it coming up. I mean, I think what is coming up is the health service, crime, cost of living. And I do think that, I just question the timing and now in the run-up to a local election period. I think there is a moment and a calm when this can be done. And let's face it, that for 20 years now, people have been able to, trans women and trans men, have been able to apply for certificates. And so, to suggest that suddenly there's this massive army coming over the mountain of some description is very unfair and very inaccurate.
The whole tenor of this debate is I think your party is partly to blame for this. And you have people in your party who want to exclude people from Liberal Democrat membership if they can be described as TERFs.
Well, I would never use that term.
No, well, I think it's
about
a disgusting
anyone,
term.
but also there are equally terms on other sides. So, on the heated side of this debate, I do not want, I do not approve of, the real intolerant heat on either side of this debate. So let me make that very, very clear. But that said, I think that this is a tolerant country that we live in, and I applaud it in terms of making progress in this area. So let me give you a tiny anecdote, if I may, from when I was working at Number 10, because it was for a very short period of time. But it was at the exact time when we were talking about equal marriage. And a Conservative special, I was one of only 2 Liberal Democrats working in Number 10, A Conservative special advisor approached me and asked me to get Lynn Featherstone to slow down on this issue. Well, you know Lynn. And first of all, I didn't even bother. And secondly, had I done, she would have ignored me quite rightly. And it was because it was a much vexed and debated issue at the time. And that special advisor was saying to me that the churches were getting quite litigious. Not going to name that person out of respect to that person. But, always we get into much vexed issues. And I think society already is in a superb place on that issue, having moved on. And I'm hopeful that we will be on there.
OK. Silkie.
I think if the Equality and Human Rights Commission says that we need clarity and the government thinks we need clarity, and we do have a public debate that is not healthy about these issues, there isn't a proper understanding, I think, of whether the Equality Act is referring to legal sex or biological sex. And some people will have different views even on what biological sex means. So I think, even if this is a minority issue, that's the whole point of equality law. Minorities matter. And so, it is important and it is urgent, I think, to have a look at it and to have clarity. I support people's right to live however they want to, and to have laws in place that enable them to live freely and with respect and safely. You can't do that if you don't have clarity on what the law is. So that is really needed. On gender recognition certificates, there are over 250,000 people in the UK who identify as trans, and only about 7,000 have gender recognition certificates. I think that, this obviously is a very fast moving discussion that has been very, very poor at times. And absolutely wrong for any party. I think actually, Iain, I couldn't agree with you more that part of the reason that the discussion is so bad is because politicians have failed to offer a kind of stewardship of it in a way, and to defend everyone's right to speak. And something that we've been concerned about is the amount on both sides of the debate, and that's just really not acceptable. So hopefully the legal review and the clarity will help to give a bit more light than heat.
Do you, as a woman, feel that there should be women-only spaces?
I feel very strongly that women-only spaces have a really important role to play in our country, in our society. They can be life-saving. I've had to rely on women's-only spaces and services. Many women like, for example, to have a female doctor. It's really sensitive. It's really important. That position, in my book, does not mean at all that I don't also welcome trans women and trans people to live their lives as they want. But clearly there is confusion here about...
a women's changing room in a swimming pool. There are comparatively few incidents of where this is a problem, but just because there are a few, that doesn't mean to say that they should be ignored.
Absolutely. And that's why I think this issue around definitions and what the law currently says is so important, and we really need to be clear on that. And also because we can't understand what the state of play is unless we have proper statistics. And how do we know that our statistics are accurate unless we know what we're talking about when we talk about gender and sex and male and female and so on?
That is the problem for people on the, shall I say, the women's only spaces side of the argument, in that when you say to them, well, how many incidents have there been in changing rooms over the last 5 years, or how many female prisoners have been assaulted by trans women in prisons? And answer comes there none, most of the time. And when you do look into the statistics, they are incredibly rare incidents. Ben Habib.
Well, I think I endorse everything both panellists said before me. This is a very small issue. It is
not to the people concerned, though.
A lot of people concerned. I don't want to diminish the importance of the issue by saying it's small, but it is small. It affects, as you said, 250,000 people, which is 0.4% of the United Kingdom's population. But I think it's part of a bigger problem, and I'm going to broaden the debate, if I may. There's a kind of cultural battle going on over language and how it's used and how we identify ourselves. And this is a subsect of that battle. Take Isla Bryson, for example, who was, convicted of raping 2 women and was going to be sent to an all-female jail. Now, the sort of, man on the Clapham omnibus, that's as daft as brushes, isn't it? You send a rapist to an all-female jail. But somehow our language has been hijacked and the issues have been hijacked and conflated. And we've taught
By
ourselves...
whom?
Well, I mean, I don't know the answer to by whom, but as you said, there's a failure in definitions, and it should be clear what a woman is. It should be clear what a transgender man is. And I actually think the terminology, if I'm to really reflect on it ad infinitum, I think the terminology of transgender man is wrong. I think if you're a woman that's become a man, then you're a transgender woman.
No, you're not.
But I know you're not.
Entirely the wrong way round.
I know. But that's not how I see it, because I think you're a woman, but you've transgendered, so you're a transgender woman. And I don't think she ever becomes a man, and I don't think a man who transgenders to being a woman ever becomes a woman. He's a transgender man. Anyway, I don't want to labour the point, but I think it's part of a much bigger cultural battle that's going on over language. And you might have read Oxfam came out with a 92-page report the other day, banning words like father, mother, headquarters, trying to decolonise the use of language, a sort of move against our heritage, our history, our values. And I think this is part of that battle. I'm not saying it's the only thing that's going on, but it's one of the reasons people get so heated, because it's part of a much bigger cultural war that's going on.
Robert Hayward.
I undertook the review of the Equality Act in certain aspects in 2012. And what's interesting about it is that throughout that period of the review, in terms of the red tape associated with it, the issue of trans never came up once. And the whole Equality Act needs review. It's only been in operation now for 13 years. But, for example, protected characteristics, there's a range of protected characteristics, but there are other groups, for example, people who are coming out of care home, disproportionate amount of whom finish up in prison, lobbying very hard, and they've got lots of councils in support of them, should now be treated as a protected characteristic. So I think there is a need for a review, not just of this one element, where society's moved on, issues have moved on, but a broader review of the equalities legislation, because we are now looking at things in a very different light from the way we did when the legislation was in 2010, which was an excellent piece of legislation in its time. But that process was almost completed. I was involved. I steered through the House of Lords the same-sex marriage legislation in Northern Ireland, which completed that element of the equality legislation. So there is a need, but I agree with Ben that there has been a hijacking of certain elements of language and processes where some people are absolutely determined to go too far in terms of the actions that they take. And I think it's sensible that you do have a review. Whether it's at this point, I must admit, I am surprised that the EHRC has said that they need a review, because I would have thought that they actually had been in that process of reviewing these sorts of issues, because after all said and done, the legislation's been going through the mill in Scotland and has been banned down here. So I am really surprised that it's taken so long for the EHRC to say we need a review now.
But the current Equalities Act does protect single-sex spaces, doesn't it?
Yes.
Are you content, Olly, with the tone of the discussion generally there?
Iain, always.
Excellent.
What can I say?
Right, we'll move on to something else in a moment. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel. It's 8:33. News headlines with Serena Farrow.
The Prime Minister has defended plans to house around 500 asylum seekers in a barge off the Dorset coast. Local Tory councillors and the area's Conservative MP have all threatened legal action over the move. Members of what police are calling a network of child abusers have been convicted in the biggest operation of its kind in the West Midlands. Several trials have led to 21 criminals facing sentences of up to a life jail term. And the chairman of the Infected Blood Inquiry wants to see the compensation scheme extended. He argues parents and children of those who died should be entitled to a payment. LBC weather, that rain spreading eastwards tonight, leaving a few showers behind and a low of 3 degrees.
This is LBC.
.37 on LBC. Silkie, Carlo from Big Brother Watch is here. Lord Robert Hayward, Baroness Olly, Grender and Ben Habib, former Brexit Party MEP, now with Reform UK. Now, Reform UK has existed now, I think, for 18 months, a couple of years. Why has it taken you so long, Ben?
Well, I was reluctant to get into any form of party politics after Brexit was sort of half done, when we half left the EU. But the final straw for me, I think, was Rishi Sunak hoodwinking the public. And I imagine I'll be in disagreement with most people on this panel. I hope I'm not, but I imagine I would be, when I say that the Windsor Framework is just another form of the Northern Ireland Protocol. But he's managed to get it passed off as some kind of magical solution to the massive constitutional damage done by the Northern Ireland Protocol to our country. And I thought, well, enough is enough. I've got to have a political mechanism by which I can take a political fight on with the Conservative Party. You can't do that as a campaigner. If you want to make an impact, you've got to be able to threaten someone electorally. You've got to threaten a political party electorally, because if unless you can do that, you're not achieving anything.
So you're going to stand at the next election?
I did. At my launch with Anne Widdecombe. Anne Widdecombe and I are completely aligned on this, and we both agreed we had to join Reform. And we even asked Richard Tice to change the logo of Reform at the time to include Save the Union and Brexit properly as part of it. which he's now done. And so at that launch, I was I think I was the only one who put my hand up saying, I absolutely will stand. There's no point being in a political party if you're not prepared to stand. And our aim, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, is to do maximum damage, forgive me, to the Conservative Party, because...
And make a Labour government more likely.
That may be the case. But what you can't do is reward failure with incumbency. And we've had 13 years of what I would regard as utterly failed Conservative government. We've got a state that was much bigger than it was when they took over, national debt much higher than it was when they took over, taxes much higher, a broken economy, broken labour market, broken NHS, broken public service.
We haven't got time for a full manifesto.
And a broken country. This is but that's, you asked me why I'm motivated back into politics. And
I think you've explained it very well. Right, let's go to another caller. Hassan's in Cambridge. Hello, Hassan.
Hello.
Hassan, go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is Suella Braverman right to blame Pakistani culture on sort of preying on white underage girls, or is she using far-right Islamophobic sort of language to focus or cherry-pick on a very serious problem, but she's focusing on a very small subset of sexual child abuse instances?
Okay, Ben Habib.
Well, I think the caller's wrong in saying that Suella Braverman picked on Pakistani culture. What Suella said, and I completely agree with her, is that one mustn't be shy of challenging an issue, in this case, the grooming of young children, I think 1,400 over a 30-year period, just because the people who are being accused are of a specific racial background. In this case, it happened to be Pakistani men. I don't think she was using the culture against them. She did say that there are some Pakistanis who view women in a way that it is not consistent with our values in this country, and I also agree with that. And there's absolutely no doubt that in the case of Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, that grooming was allowed to continue unchallenged without the full force of the law being brought to bear because people were afraid of being accused of being racist. And she's absolutely right to debug that debate and say you've got to be entirely blind to ethnicity in this regard. Actually, I think, slightly on the trans kind of debate, we've got to be completely blind to whether people are from, in all walks of life, irrespective of what your ethnic background is, irrespective of your religious background, irrespective of your sexual preferences, your gender identity, everyone needs to be treated equally, and that applies as much to the Pakistani men who are grooming these children as anyone else.
Olly Grender.
So we're talking today at a moment when a particularly nasty group in the West Midlands have been sentenced, even today. And I want to refer to a good friend of mine, Louise Casey, who's currently taking
good friend of this programme,
a very well-earned rest after doing a fantastic piece of work about the Metropolitan Police. And some people may not have picked up her very kind and impassioned offer to cover this issue next, the issue of the protection of children and kind of the issue of
we wanted to be the new
safe.
Metropolitan Police Commissioner.
Well, I mean, obviously, and the Pope and everything else, Iain. But I think that it is terrifying. Even the Metropolitan Police, kind of report the issue of almost, the abuse of children taking second place. The fact that the police aren't looking at abuse of children. So, but I do want to answer the caller Hassan as well, which is that I felt uncomfortable when I heard Suella Braverman talking about this on Sunday. I think it is right to call out different groups when child abuse is happening. I think it's absolutely right, but I think we need to tread with quite a lot of care. And I agree with Ben, which is probably the first time this evening.
Oh, really? You've been very quiet.
Apologies. But I do agree that, in something like specifically the Rotherham report, there was of fear of calling it out, because of fear of being accused of racism. But I don't think we should allow that to become an accepted fact.
I think
across the board, because I think there are some terrible issues going on, and I think online is particularly bad. And we've only discovered today that the police aren't properly policing that, either online abuse of children and picking it up and dealing with it at speed. And so I think there's a lot of issues of abuse of children that we absolutely need to.
I think it is right to point out,
and we're not at the moment,
that most of the cases that came to light in the middle of the last decade, and I can remember doing countless phone-ins on them, and I can remember myself saying, it is not unfair to point out that the common thread here is that they are from a British Pakistani cultural background. I didn't say Muslim. I didn't say a racial background. I think it was described as a cultural thing, and the police were afraid, as you say, to get involved. Now, this case today, which you mentioned in the West Midlands, 21 people have been convicted of the abuse of children aged 12 or younger in the Walsall and Wolverhampton areas. It's the largest child sex abuse case investigated by West Midlands Police ever. All 21 people convicted are white. So it is wrong to say that it is only in one particular section of our society.
Right. Exactly right.
I think the differences with the Rotherham, Telford, etc., with those ones, was that the grooming gangs were predominantly from those cultures. The individual abusers tended not to be. And if you just count the people up who've been convicted, there are obviously far more white people than British Pakistanis.
There are, and I think it's right, Ian, although I'm sure you'll correct me, that actually the largest number of cases of child abuse at the moment in the UK are young white men. I think that's right.
But the majority of the population is also white.
Yes.
OK, let's bring in Robert.
You'd expect that.
Can I just pick up on Louise Casey first?
Very briefly, because we're running out of time.
OK, I just wanted to quote from a mixed-race policeman who sent me a message saying, please convey a message to Louise Casey to say that it was a brilliant report. He's politically incorrect, but it was a brilliant report, so I agree very much on that side. In relation to the sexual abuse cases, we have been too scared for too long to actually say these things. It's come on this occasion from two people from different non-white ethnic backgrounds, i.e. the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, and I think it's about time too, because it reassures other people that we're looking at the issue on a population-wide basis.
Silkie.
I didn't see the comments, but I would say there are lots of reasons that police are apprehensive to investigate and prosecute these cases. They were apprehensive about investigating Jimmy Savile. They're apprehensive about investigating Jeffrey Epstein in the US and his grooming gang. So I don't see this as a race issue. Actually, male violence against women is one of the things, sadly, that is truly cross-cultural. What I would really like to see the Home Secretary saying is what she's going to do about the fact that de facto rape has been decriminalised in this country, because under 1% of cases are being prosecuted.
Look at the case in Scotland this week.
Begs belief. The 13-year-old girl who was raped, and the attacker was found guilty and then allowed to walk free. What a disgrace in our country.
Yeah.
You've got total agreement on the panel on that. Yeah. No question.
I have, apart from on Twitter, I've yet to see anybody sort of think that is a reasonable thing to do. But it's a judicial decision, but the guidance, I gather, was changed relatively recently to say that anyone under the age of 25 should not be treated the same as somebody over 25 because their brains aren't formed yet. I mean, seriously, absolute rubbish. Right, it's not for me to issue an opinion, but I just have. It's 8:47.
LBC.
8:51 on LBC. Silkie, Carlo, Robert Hayward, Olly, Grender and Ben Habib with me taking your calls. Just to say, after 9 o'clock, we're going to be talking about surrogacy, which is an issue I know very little about. I don't have strong opinions on it, so I'm relying on you to call in after that hour. Otherwise, it might be a very lonely hour for me. I want to know what the challenges are that parents face when they go through surrogacy. Is go through the right term? I don't even know. I'm going to get into so much trouble in this hour, I think.
It won't be the first time.
I kind of wish we'd done the trans issue instead, which says a lot. Right, let's move on to another question. It's a text question. Oh, and breaking news, Suella Braverman has won her re-selection battle over Flick Hammond in the new Tory constituency of Fareham and Waterlooville. Your instant reaction, Robert Hayward?
I didn't know who was going to win. I genuinely didn't know where the balance of membership was. It doesn't surprise me, but I didn't know for certain. I was asked earlier on several times who it would be. But it causes a problem for Flick Drummond because she now has to know where she will go. Paul Holmes, who is the other MP who would have faced Suella if she had lost this evening, will almost certainly now take Hamble Valley as the constituency to the west, which he would have had to compete with Suella for.
OK, let's go to a text question from Thomas in Barnsley. Talks between Royal Mail and the postal unions have collapsed again. They were offered a 10% pay rise and a £1,500 payment. Should they just get back to work now? Now, just a bit of background to this. Royal Mail bosses said members of the CWU, the Communications Workers Union, were offered a 10% pay rise over 3 years. And see, that's different, isn't it?
Yeah,
10% pay rise. Yeah. A 10% pay rise over 3 years and a one-off payment of up to £1,500, depending on the employee's current salary. The CWU says it is willing to continue negotiations. You see, when I saw the question, I was thinking, well, how can they turn down a 10% pay rise plus £1,500? But it's not quite that simple, is it? Silkie?
Well, that's the thing. Inflation is at about 10%, right? So people are being offered a pay package that doesn't allow them to meet the rising cost of living. And I don't think that that's an unreasonable ask. Also, my understanding is that the reason that the talks collapsed this time is because some of the newer staff want pay parity with the longer serving staff within 3 years. And they're being offered within 5 years. I mean, some of this you think surely can be ironed out. These are not really unreasonable asks, and the cost that we're paying is absolutely huge. Or the cost to Royal Mail, the strikes have cost them 200 million so far. There were 18 strike days at the end of last year, and there's a serious question about whether Royal Mail can survive if these strikes continue.
And this is not just about pay, this is about working conditions. It's about the way that workers are being treated by Royal Mail management, which, if you've listened to this programme before, I have some fairly strong views on, but I'll keep them to myself for the purposes of this because we haven't got too much time. So short answers, please. Ben?
Well, when these strikes first kicked off last summer, I had great sympathy, actually, for the strikers. And I think the working and middle classes have been really, I can't use the language that I want to use, but, they've been really maltreated from a great height for many years. And they've had tax thresholds frozen so that even if they do earn more, they're actually paying, greater sums to the government. So I've got great sympathy with them. I completely agree with you that if the cost of living's gone up 10%, then they should have a right to get something close to 10%. It's also eye-wateringly bad, I think, that the public sector pensions have this triple lock, giving them the higher of the average increase in salaries, 2.5%, or inflation. Whereas people who worked for the last 13 years, I think in aggregate, the overall public sector wage growth in the last 13 years has been about 5%. And inflation over that period has been about 35%. So even though we look at 10% now as being eye-watering, they've been maltreated for a long, long time. And so I've got great sympathy. How we get out of this problem is, who knows, because we haven't got the money to pay.
Robert?
I used to spend my time negotiating pay deals for the management side with trade unions, and I find it very difficult for other people to start saying, you should do this, you should do that. The people who should resolve a dispute are those on either side of the table, and it should be left to them. The one danger in the particular case of the Royal Mail is that there are loads of competitors around, they're losing market share in one way or another, and sadly, there is every risk that the Royal Mail will not continue to exist if they price themselves out of the market, because communications have moved from letters to emails to packages, etc., and society is changing.
Olly.
Although everyone's buying stuff online, and the potential for Royal Mail to be brilliant and knockout is very, very high. I completely agree about the inflation issues. I completely agree about a workforce that has had a legacy of a very difficult situation. I think what's difficult with this one is it's a private company with a public service. And
it was privatised by the Liberal Democrats.
And indeed it was, but that was a very long time ago, and this is nothing to do with that.
It was only 11 years ago. It's not that long. We all remember, Olly.
Thanks, Iain. So, I mean, I just think there are certain moments when I think the government can use and deploy, and I've been really surprised about these strikes because the power of using the potential and the power to get people round a table in number 10 is very, very significant. And I just feel that sometimes it has been underused.
Not used at all. Yeah.
Particularly over some of these strikes, like the head teachers announcing today. I mean, when head teachers
number 10, having the Royal Mail, it's a privatised company. What role is number 10 got?
They do it with businesses all the time.
But we could have done it with genuine public sector workers, didn't they? With the NHS, for example.
No, you can't do it with the Royal Mail workers. Are we going to have it for the passport office and everything else?
I just think there is potential for government to get involved.
We've all sparked to life when we've only got a minute left.
Sorry to be controversial in that final bit.
Let's go to our fun question at the end of the programme. Janet is in Norwich. The King and Queen have started sending out invitations to next month's coronation ceremony. Panel, you're allowed to pick one person who you want to be there. It can't be yourself. It can't be me. So who are you sending? Olly.
Well, we've already talked about her. Louise Casey is, to me, a national public treasure, and she should definitely go. She's probably already got an invite. I don't know.
Robert.
Elton John, as far as I'm concerned, would make wonderful guest, but I'm not sure after the funeral for Diana whether he would be invited.
Well, he ought to. He's a national treasure.
He is, and that's why I've suggested him.
Ben?
Well, mine undoubtedly would be David Attenborough. You know, I've been a fan of his all my life, and my daughter, who's doing zoology at Bristol University, is a fan of his too. And he, with the exception of some of his views on net zero, he's unarguably a fantastic human being, and he's made a fantastic contribution to this country and wildlife generally. So, yeah, David Attenborough.
Silkie.
Mine would be Graham Smith, the head of the campaign group Republic, because that would shake things up a bit.
So if all these people have already been invited,
you've just disinvited yourself ever being on this panel again.
Sorry.
If all these people have already been invited, can we have another go?
Joanna Lumley. That's who I'd pick. She's a national treasure, isn't she?
I bet they've all been invited.
I think they would have done. But we should point out that two of us had the opportunity to apply and neither of us did.
Well, more fool you is all I can say. Once in a lifetime
in a ballot.
Well, honestly, you don't know you're born being in the House of Lords, and you don't get to the perk of going to the Royal
We chose
coronation.
not to.
Well,
it's called a democratic
Actually, I didn't choose. I forgot to write back.
It was that high
Robert
up on
Hayward, Olly Grender, Ben Habib and Silkie Carlo, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this edition of Cross Question. Don't forget, if you miss an edition of Cross Question, you can catch up on Global Player. Coming up in the next hour, Tom Daly and his husband, Dustin Lance Black, have celebrated the arrival of their second child together. They announced the surprise news today. They'd not previously shared they were expecting another child. Now, of course, they have had a surrogate baby. think that's the right expression. But the law is about to change on surrogacy too, because couples could become a surrogate child's legal parents at birth under a major new proposal to reform UK surrogacy laws. Under the new plans, the surrogate, the woman who carries the baby, would be able to withdraw her consent up to 6 weeks after the birth, and by that point she'd have to apply for a parental order to obtain legal parental status instead of the intended parents. What are the challenges in surrogacy?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the former chief executive of the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon's husband Peter Murrell has been released without charge, pending further investigation. Police arrested him over party finances and their Glasgow home's been searched, with an evidence tent seen in their garden. LBC's Sophie Adams has more details.
Officers carried out searches at a number of other addresses too, not just his home, one of those being at the SNP's headquarters in Edinburgh. And on Wednesday, Scotland's new First Minister Hamza Yousaf says he doesn't believe investigations into the SNP's finances was the reason that Nicola Sturgeon quit. He believes she was